Welcome back to LIS570. This week we're going to talk about the topic of writing up our results. This is really the last stage in the research process that we're going to cover in this class. And as such, it's kind of an exciting one. It's when we turn some of the assumptions and some of what we claim to have known into actual statements, where we become clear about what it is we found and what it is we have recognized as a set of limitations to the research that we've undertaken. So in the next few slides, what I'm going to try to do is unpack this idea of writing up our results and presenting them to different audiences. But more importantly, what I'm going to try to do is give you some tips on, given the different commitments, given the different paradigms that we're all a part of, how it is we can craft some convincing statements that help us communicate what it is we know and how it is we know it. So let's jump in and take a look at what we're going to talk about over the course of our lecture today. So we're going to first deal with, for the overview of the course, I'm going to try to situate some of what we talk about in terms of writing up our results, where this fits into the stages of research that we've talked about. Then I'm going to present a little bit of an overview on, given the different paradigms or given the different commitments that we have, what are the expectations around us presenting or publishing our results. Then I'm going to offer what are really my 8 tips on how to write about research and how to do that in a convincing way that makes it clear what your findings are and makes you a responsible individual in terms of presenting your results to your peers. All right, so far this quarter, we've talked about 4 discrete stages of our research. We talked about planning, in which we took the commitments that we had to what kinds of things exist in the world and how we come to know about them, that is our ontological and our epistemic commitments, and we figured out how that fit into a paradigm of research. And from those paradigms, we started to review some of the literature and to generate questions about what we wanted to seek and answer in terms of the research project that we're working on designing for this class. Now, in the next set of stages, we looked at designing and then executing our research. And in designing, we talked about instruments, we talked about the ways in which we could develop reliable samples that would help us to generalize about some of the findings we might have. And in doing so, we came up with a set of methods that we wanted to use that we would collect and then analyze our data. The final stage that we're going to talk about today is the reporting. That is, when we look back and reflect on everything that we've done, we've created quite a bit of resources and quite a bit of knowledge, but now our job is really to try to figure out how we go about communicating what it is we think we know and proving to our colleagues that we found that out and we know it in a reliable way. So in the same way that we try to convince the Institutional Review Board that we have a sound, ethical way in which we have planned on how to do our research, the stage that comes after we analyze our data and we figure out what it is we think that we know is really about convincing our peers that we've done this ethical research. We've analyzed it in a number of different ways. We've thought about and we've considered things like external validity or internal validity. And here's what we think we know, and here's how we think we know it. Now, this is undeniably complex, and it's undeniably shaped by the research traditions that we're a part of. That is, positivists, constructivists, or design-based researchers all have different ways in which they expect to see an argument presented and a set of results presented in a formal paper. So let's take a second to review kind of what those different commitments might look like across our 3 traditions. So positivism, constructivism, and design-based research are going to differ from one another on a number of different dimensions. What I'm going to try to unpack or make clear is the expectations that someone working in that community might have around published results. Now, these publications can come in the form of, say, a evaluation, something like a white paper that we put out and we just publish on our own website, or it could come in the form of a very formal journal or conference proceeding, which we submit and we have peer reviewed. But undeniably, across these, right, there's expectations about how results are going to be first presented and then argued for. So the first dimension that we should thing to consider is the structure with which a positivist, a constructivist, or a design-based researcher expects there to be for any paper that they read within their field. Now, a positivist is going to have a very prescribed structure. It's going to look something like an abstract, a set of results, a discussion of those results, and then some conclusion that wrap up tidily and explain any of the limitations that may be had. A constructivist working on, say, maybe interpreting a particular scenario is going to have a much more adaptable structure. That is, there's undeniably going to be an abstract, and there's going to be also a conclusion. But between that, where the methods are described, where observations are maybe unpacked, where some data like a interview is offered as some evidence of knowing something, can all be negotiated. That is, there's kind of a broad adaptable middle which constructivists will argue around and make a part of the contribution to the research journal or the research conference that they're submitting to. And design-based researchers are similar, right? A very formal design-based paper will oftentimes follow the 8 stages that we talked about in our lecture last week. And sometimes there will be a very clear section where there's a prototype and there's different evaluations and implementations of that prototype. Other times it's very much up for negotiation. So it somewhat depends on what kind of design-based work we're doing and what kinds of ultimately artifacts we're producing in our design-based research. The next dimension let's talk about is the expectation for accepting results. Now, positivists, right, in our commitments to believing that there are right and wrong answers, are going to look for the significance of, say, a statistical test. That is, if we have a result and that result is significant, then what a sort of reviewer of a positivist paper is going to try to consider is whether or not the, say, tests that we've run are applicable to the data that we have, and whether or not the results that we have are verifiable. If they are, then this is a result that seems worthy of our attention and worthy of our publication. Now, the expectations for results in terms of them being convincing or being verifiable are really just that within constructivist and design-based research. Because remember, in both of these paradigms, we sort of have an idea that our research is about stating arguments, that there's multiple truths, and that our truths that we're presenting to, say, one another are about making an argument which seems to help us understand some aspect of the world. Now, we don't have something like an equation or something like a table of numbers that we look at and we check off and say whether or not we think they're right or they're wrong, right? We have convincingness of an argument, and we have the verifiability. That is, we know that a person worked in a particular place at a particular period of time, and the kinds of things that they're arguing around seem reliable, right? And the same is true with design-based research. We're going to take at a certain amount of acceptance that a person actually designed and built this artifact. We'll probably look for maybe some diagrams or maybe some pictures or some evidence that that artifact exists. And we're going to look for the narrative, that is the argument that the researchers are producing, to have convincingness for us as peer reviewers. Okay, so the next dimension that we might think about that differentiates different ways of writing up our results then are around how the findings are presented. So in positivist-based research, we oftentimes put the results first without any kind of commentary. And then in the next section, we follow up with and describe or discuss what the relevance of different sets of results are. Now, constructivists, this would seem crazy, right? Because what a constructivist is going to believe is that if there's multiple truths, then part of our job is, when we're making an argument, to offer the evidence that we see, that we think that we have, and unpack that evidence over time for our audience. Design-based researchers, similarly, are going to try to follow a cycle of design, such as providing evidence for why maybe some evidence from, say, our requirements gathering suggested that we build the prototype that we did. And if we have our prototype and we've tested it, this is why we changed it, or this is how we changed it, right? So the findings are going to work more cyclical rather than linear as they would in a positivist-based research. Okay, and then the final dimension that we might differentiate these different research traditions around is based on the venues in which we submit and present our research. So positivist researchers oftentimes work in both peer-reviewed conferences, that is competitively we submit a publication that is 8 to 10 pages long to a conference. We have a set of peers review that, and then if it's accepted to the conference, we present our paper in front of our peers. Positivists also use journals. Journals being a regularly published outlet that has a pool of peer reviewers and an editor. And those pool of peer reviewers and those editors judge the worthiness or the merit of particular papers on particular topics and then regularly publish those. Constructivists tend to work more in the journal tradition, that is, submitting to a set of editors that are very specific around a very specific topic, and then publishing from there. Design-based researchers are really much more about conferences. There are journals in the design space, but conference proceedings such as CHI or the Human-Computer Interaction of the ACM conference is kind of the biggest and most important in that particular discipline. So these are some of the ways that we can unpack and differentiate the different ways or traditions of publishing and writing up the findings for our different paradigms of research. What I'm going to do next is talk about, across all of these paradigms, across all of these different dimensions, what are some of the things that help us present and communicate our research results to an audience that makes them convincing, but also makes them compelling? Because these are both of the things that we want to be able to do. We want people to actually read what we've written, but we want people to understand exactly what it is that we've done and how it is that we know what we claim to know. So I'm going to try to do this through 8 or 9 different steps. Along the way, try to communicate some of the things that I find compelling about research across these different paradigms. All right, so just as we talked about in the last table, there being a structure. Every piece of writing that you'll do in a formal academic setting or a formal research setting will have an expected form. You should understand and know that form before you start writing, because it can help us to shape then how it is we go about building our arguments. So if we're working on evaluation writing, we might start with an executive summary and end with a discussion. If we're starting on peer-reviewed writing, we might, as I said before, start with the abstract, work to the conclusion, and in between there have some methods and some findings. Now, I think there's a particular way in which we can take apart what are all of these expectations and build them into, and maybe this is just the way that my brain works, a kind of executable set of steps. So I will link to this in our course book, but of course, I'll also try and show you and unpack what exactly I mean in this executable steps. So for me, when I start to write a paper, I use the same form and I use it over and over again, whether I'm writing by myself or I'm writing with someone else. So this form looks something like this. So I have kind of a paper section that's titled here, and I have some notes on what I need to do to complete that section of the paper. Then I give myself a due date, and then I work linearly through the paper. So I start by just coming up with a title. Then I come up with a skeleton, which is my basic outline of the paper. I then begin to build out different parts of the skeleton, such as my introduction, my related work or my literature review, the methods, the results, and the conclusions. And I do that iteratively, step by step. So I may work on the intro for one version, work on a second intro, and then compare the two, find out which one I like, and then go with one and iterate over that for a couple of cycles. So you can see what I'm doing here in terms of the notes of how I go about writing a paper. And what I try to do is finish all of these steps so that by 2 days before the deadline, I have a completed draft and I can show it to a colleague. I can take it to one of my students can take it to me, and we can understand whether or not we have something that seems like a reasonable thing to submit, whether that's to a conference or to a journal. So this works really well for me. But one of the things that I want to emphasize is that understanding the structure and then writing an outline to match that structure is one of the kind of most important things we can do to attenuate ourselves to the expectations of our readers. All right, second, abstracts regardless of where we're publishing, are our reader's outline. And as such, let me move myself down a little bit here. So as such, they need to be convincing and a concise map of the paper that an audience is going to ultimately read. Now, although this is a condensed version of our research, I typically think that there's kind of two arguments that work really well for social science abstracts. And those two kind of types of arguments work in the following ways. There's either the they say versus we say, or the what's new here type of argument. So for they say versus we say, it's exactly how it sounds. So way we might start there is previous research has argued that X, but here we demonstrate that Y is equally important. Or something has been found before, but we think that this is potentially misguided or wrong, so we investigate why. Right? The thing that we're doing with a they say versus we say argument is we're differentiating ourselves from what might be the traditional or the existing body of literature. So when we look at, for example, in our literature review, a gap in the research, we're going to try to differentiate ourselves from that gap, right? We're going to try to say, no one's looked at this, and we're going to differentiate ourselves from all of the other literature. Now, another way that's equally compelling and equally effective is to take the kind of what's new about an existing or long-standing problem in a field. So the what's new here approach says something like, a long-standing challenge in the field of library and information science is X. But recent events, such as the pandemic of COVID-19, require a new, renewed attention to X or to Y, right? And what we're doing here is we're saying, well, we're not differentiating ourselves from the, say, existing body of literature. We're saying that the problem itself has fundamentally changed. So it's not that no one else knows about this, it's that no one else has looked at this yet because something different has emerged, and that different context requires our new attention. All right, so either of these ways in which we advance or we start our argument in the abstract helps us outline then the way in which we're going to make an argument and the way we're going to defend that argument based on the methods and the findings that we have. Now, one of the most important things about an abstract is you gotta offer your audience some aspect of your research that's interesting, right? We gotta convince people that it's worth their time to go in and now read the different sections of our paper. And one of the ways we can convincingly do that is to tell people what's new or what's different about our research and what we actually know or what we claim to know. And if they take us at face value, maybe they stop reading the abstract and stop there. But if they're really interested and they say, gee, that's phenomenally interesting, how did they find that out? They're probably going to keep reading. All right, so my next step then is about the way in which we provide signposts for our readers that they can navigate and make their way through our argument in a kind of tidy fashion. So one of the ways that I think about this is what my advisor used to tell me is that research isn't a magic show and it's not a crime novel. We're not building suspenseful narratives and we're not building surprising narratives. What we're doing is trying to communicate very clearly factual information. That is, we know that we did something, we know that what we found, and we know what we're trying to convince our readers is important about those findings. So in the same way that journalists don't bury a lead, researchers shouldn't bury their findings. Right? Up front in our abstracts, in our introductions, we should be telling our readers exactly what we're going to claim to know and how we're going to claim to know it. And so providing signposts that help our readers get through our research helps them understand in exactly what section we're going to defend a part of our argument and exactly what section they can plan to read more about what it is we're trying to claim. Another way that I kind of think about this in terms of signposting is that I always want to be one step ahead of my reader. That is, as I'm coming to the end of a section, I'm trying to determine, well, what is the reader expecting to come next? And if it's what I'm going to present to them, if I'm doing a good job, that is, I'm going to tell them exactly what's coming next. I'm going to leave no surprises. So one of the ways that I try to do that is by transforming my research, my conclusions of a research section into what I call a speech act, right? Saying it makes it so. First, I'm going to review the literature. Next, I'm going to present findings, and those findings are going to convince you that what we've found is the case. After we present the findings, then we're going to provide some contextual discussion. It's going to further prove that our findings are what we say they are and how it is that we found them out, right? All of this is doing is building our arguments to be unimpeachable and building them so that our readers know how to navigate each of the different sections that we're trying to step them through. So tip 3 is really about signposting our arguments so that our readers don't have to guess or be surprised about where they're going. All right, tip 4 is around passive voice. So this is very much a stylistic decision, but I'm going to try to convince you that a passive voice is really reserved for passive research. And I don't think that any of us, regardless of the commitments that we make, are trying to be engaged in passive research. So let's consider a couple of sentences and the ways they may be interpreted by an audience. So the first sentence says, a set of data was retrieved through a query interface by researchers. And the second sentence, which says exactly the same thing, but not using a passive voice, says, we assembled a data set using the Facebook query interface. Now, the first sentence makes it seem like there's a detached, any set of researchers could do something very scientifically, like use a query interface. The second makes it possessive. It makes it ours. It makes it seem that we did this thing, and we did this thing using a specific interface, right? The point here is that when we interject self, that is, we put we, I, ours into the explanations that we're making in our research, we're interjecting and we're reminding our readers that there is some subjectivity in the choices that we made, some success at doing that kind of writing. But I think ultimately it'll make you come across as being awfully sterile and not being something that really people want to spend their time reading. And ultimately, we want people to engage with our communication. So by centering self and reminding readers that we had some choices and we believe we made the right choices, and this is how we made the right choices, I think we move from doing passive research to doing active, engaged research. And that, to me, means that you have an active and engaged voice in your research. All right, so my next tip is about how we present results. I think that in an effective research paper, we can often present results in multiple ways. But there's a couple of things to keep in mind when we're presenting our results for an audience. The first is that if we're taking a positivist bent, that is, we're making an argument that's based on numerical results, then oftentimes we're going to refer to statistical tests that we've run. But it's not enough to simply say that using a z-score, say as a methodology, we came up with 0.06. Right? We have to interpret, we have to explain, as if we have an educated audience, exactly what a z-score is and why that's relevant as a statistical test given the data that we have. This helps our peers to review us in that they understand and know why it is we use the test that we did. But it also helps the uninitiated to understand this score means this thing, and this is how I should interpret whether or not that's a good score or a bad score. Okay, similarly, if we're doing either constructivist or we're doing positivist research, when we present something like a descriptive statistic, say 54% of our demographic included female participants, right? We have to not only give percentages, but we have to back those up with the real numbers, that is the amount of our sample that 54% actually results in. Right? So 54% of our sample may be actually an N of 17, right? But unless we remind our readers, we're asking them to go back to the total sample number, take 54%, and then realize that, well, 17 people is pretty good, but that's not all that huge. So would we think that any study claiming to know everything about female participants was true if it were 17? No, absolutely not. But if we make a a more baseless claim like 54% of females believe X, right? That sounds more convincing, and it's a little bit dishonest. So this is a pet peeve of mine, but it's something that I always try to reinforce for students, is that if you're presenting the descriptive statistics in a percentage, you have to give the real number of your sample along with those. Okay, and one other thing that I think is very important to remember is that when we use graphs, charts, or different visualizations, those are a way in which we can allow our audience to interpret the things that we claim to find, but they're not interpretations of themselves, right? They have to be explained, that is, the graphs and the charts have to be explained and interpreted for what they meaningfully tell our audience. Sometimes we can do this in the actual narrative of our paper, and other times we have to simply do this in, say, the caption to the chart or the caption to the graph. But either way we go about it, right, we can't just put a graph out and expect that that means something. We have to tell our readers what it is we think that that means. All right, so tip 6 will seem obvious, but you will be surprised in reading research papers how often in the introduction section, an individual or a set of researchers will state a research question and then never answer it. That is, they may present findings, they may say what they think they know, but they've never come back to and formally answered the research question that they stated. This is one of the most maddening things to read, I think, as an audience member or as a peer reviewer. Because if you've taken the time to think about and carefully construct research questions, it seems antithetical to good research if you don't return to those research questions and actually answer them. So what I would suggest is that in the discussion section of your paper, if you're doing positivist research, if you're doing constructivist research, it's in the second third of your paper. You come back to and you restate the research question that you posed, and then you try to attempt to formally convince your reader why you've answered that question. Maybe that's given a particular set of results. Maybe it's given a particular thing that a person said. But you should try to sum up and give your readers a sense of how certain you are about the answer and how much you think you know, given the question that you posed and the evidence that you have. This is just a basic aspect of doing research. And I think if you keenly kind of like focus in on this while you're reading other papers, you'll be very surprised at how often people don't do it. Okay, my tip 7 is something that I think also can seem surprising, but limitations are a place in formal research where we oftentimes acknowledge what it is we don't know. That is, given the bounds of the questions that we've asked, the population sample that we were able to recruit and get to participate in our research, we oftentimes have lots and lots of limitations on what we can claim to know. Some people find this as very limiting and feel like this is maybe evidence that they don't really know all that much. But I think quite the opposite. If we've set a stage for our audience in being clear about what it is we will claim to know and how we'll claim to know it, then our limitations are really just a reminder. We're telling our audience, look, we only had a sample that included 17 females. So does this extend to every female in the, say, continental US? Absolutely not. But we think this is, potentially a provocative finding, or it suggests ways in which other research may pick up our findings, use our methods, and reproduce what we found in a bigger sample. So I offer a number of ways here in which we can think about how it is we deal with the size of our sample, think of it how we deal with the diversity of our sample, and think about how it is that we might have counter examples or counter cases that would maybe suggest something else, but given the limited scope or the limited time frame of our study, we didn't have time to, say, answer all of those things. The point being here that when we state limitations, what we're reminding our readers about is really what we haven't claimed to know, so that they can't take us maybe to task, or they can't be critical of everything that we haven't found out, because we're limiting or narrowing our scope to saying exactly what it is we know and exactly what it is we would like to know more about, but we haven't addressed in this particular study. All right, so tip 8, second to last here, is that Oftentimes, I think when we write a paper linearly, as the kind of method that I laid out in the beginning, we tend to lose steam as we write. That is, we have lots of energy and we're spending lots of time writing our introduction and our literature review, and then we talk about our methods and then our findings. By the time we get to our findings, we're exhausted from writing for 2 days straight. We just want to get this up, and we just want to get it finished. So we race to get through the results section, we race to get through the discussion, and then we have a paper that looks asymmetrical. That is, we have very long introduction and literature reviews and very short results and discussion sections. But the point of us doing research, right, is to argue for and ultimately present new knowledge to the world. So what we should focus on then are actually oppositely the results and the discussion section as opposed to the introduction and the literature review. So now you may be a person that can start with, say, the results and the discussion section for writing and then return to the introduction and literature review. It's just not how my writing style works, so I don't do that. But what I do is I spend more time editing those two sections, and if I have to cut for sake length, I'm always taking from my introduction and my literature review, because that maybe sets up my argument, but ultimately the contribution, that's what my peers are going to judge me on, are going to be about the new knowledge that I've produced, and where I'll present that will be in my results and my discussion section. So when I say review each section of the paper, I mean at some point, print out maybe, or just pull up on your monitor and look at all the different sections compared to one another. We should see the second half of the paper taking up most of the room or most of the page count. And we should see the first half of the paper being tidy, clean arguments that get us to that second half. All right, and the final tip that I'll leave you with is that I think conclusions are one of the sections where oftentimes we run out of time, but oftentimes we fail to do a couple really important things and instead fall back on some bad habits of posing questions that aren't yet answered. That is, we sometimes conflate our conclusions with our limitations. So what I think of as making a strong conclusion is that we're reaffirming what it is we found. If you remember back to maybe grade school, you had a teacher that told you, tell them what you told them, right? So in our conclusion, we're kind of doing some of that, right? We're coming back to, and we're saying, in the same way that we argued in our abstract, this is what we said we would find, and this is what we actually found, and this is how we found it. And the most important things that we found, and we really emphasize those important findings. In the conclusion section, we can also do, I think, another really valuable contribution to our research fields. That is, instead of saying what limitations exist, say what future possibilities exist. That is, we can say, this is the research that we've done, and we think the most important, most exciting thing to ask or answer next is X. And some ways you might go about looking at X is build off of our results. Look at the data that we've gathered and try to expand our sample. Right, but talking about the future directions is one of the ways that we, in literature review, oftentimes look to people to suggest new directions, but also we make contributions that are beyond, say, just the results or just the discussion that we offer to our peers. Okay, and the final, I think, really important thing about the conclusion is that oftentimes we'll have in research some questions that we didn't quite answer satisfactorily. I think we should mention those, but what we shouldn't do is try to riff on those questions and ask or laundry list a new set of questions that seem provocative for future work. Because what that's doing really is just stating a bunch of things that we don't know, and it doesn't contextualize how it is we go about answering them. So for my money, what makes for a great conclusion is we reinforce what we know, what we found, and why it's important. And then we come back to saying, in the context of our broader research topic, this is why it's important for the next step of our research to ask this and to find out in this particular way. Maybe to ask about the way that 54% of females in our sample thought about, say, information seeking on a music platform. And that music platform needs to be interrogated because right now it has an asymmetry of gender. Okay, so laundry listing new questions, that's not a very helpful practice for this. But in coming to, say, a provocative conclusion in which we not just say what we think we know, but what we think others should find out, that's a really compelling way to make great contributions to your research community. Okay, so these have been my tips. This is the way that I think about and the way that I oftentimes review for, say, someone who's writing up their literature about a study. But remember, what we're doing as that kind of final stage in our research is we're taking all the things that we've done, that is the maybe samples that we've purposely developed, the instruments that we've crafted over long periods of time, the research questions and the literature review that have informed or helped us plan our research. And we're putting them all into one tidy narrative. Now, that necessarily is a reductive exercise. We're going to have to leave some important details kind of on the sidelines. So over time, I think that writing up and publishing findings gets much easier. It gets from a stage of feeling overwhelming to feeling really exciting. And hopefully, as your career progresses here at the high school and in library and information science, you'll start to get to that place in which the reporting becomes really, really fun. And when you do get to a place where that's fun, it's even more fun to then go to conferences or see your work in journals. All right, if you have any questions about reporting or about the stages that we've talked about in general, feel free to get in touch or attend your office hours this week.